This is the Pete McT channel. I'm going to be recording a series of videos based on books I'll be reading. I'm going to break them down. After each chapter, I will record a short video describing the contents of that chapter, and then I'll provide some thoughts and commentary on the material. The first book I will be reading will be A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, published in 1980. I've already read the first chapter, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. Chapter 1 was called Columbus, the Indians, and Human Progress. Basically, it detailed that upon Columbus's arrival to the Americas, landing in what is today Cuba, he met a native tribe called the Arawaks, and he noted in his own journal that they were very communal socially, they were agricultural, and they were willing traders. He noted that both with this tribe and tribes he would meet later in his journals, that was sort of a common thread, that their hospitality and goodwill was really almost foreign to the Europeans, the way they were willing to share and trade virtually everything they had right up front. Zinn quotes extensively from a book written by Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest along with the Spanish expedition. And de las Casas wrote his book called History of the Indies. Basically was transcriptions of Columbus's journals and some of the other journals of the Spaniards on the expedition. And it goes on to describe really atrocities that took place. It says really right upon the arrival, Columbus spoke of subjugating the indigenous peoples, taking from the things that he had noted, how good-willed the people were right up front, but he noted that they were unarmed. Other than bows and arrows and some spears, which they used for hunting, they were more or less unwarlike people, and this could be used to Columbus's advantage, and the Spaniards did take advantage of that rather quickly. They were contracted by the royal crown, or by the Spanish crown, to search for gold and commodities to come back and finance some of the new hierarchy and monarchies coming to power. And that basically the land really didn't have as much gold and the commodities as they had hoped. So they ended up basically dealing in human trafficking. There's that they took these people as slaves, first as tokens to send back because of the lack of gold in which they had, and later they would just take them as slaves to run the mines and find what gold and silver there was, and obviously grow crops and do other things for the Spanish settlements. In de las Casas' book, he noted that this utter annihilation led to mass suicides and killings of the indigenous people, and that some of the women would kill their own babies and young children rather than have them grow up and face the Spaniards. That really, the total control exhibited by the Europeans when they came in with their advanced weaponry, they really had little problem taking control of the tribes. That it really just broke their wills over a period of time, and not that great of a period of time. He described actually that due to death, whether it was from killing or from sickness, but also slavery migration, where they were either shipped to Europe or taken off their land to run what amounted to plantations or the mines. In the 20 years after 1492, approximately 20 years, around 80% of the indigenous people were gone off of their lands, and within 60 years, 99%. And by 1650, which was 150 years after the arrival of Columbus, there was there were no more traces of the indigenous Arawaks or any of their descendants on those islands. There's not just the death and destruction and the chaos, but also when they take them to these plantations and mines, they would separate the families into what were essentially specialized work brigades, and at that point there was also not any more propagation. because in the few times that the families were allowed to be together, there wasn't any time or motive for family building. So basically, they just attacked them from all ways, from all angles, and culturally just decimated the indigenous people. Zinn goes on in the first chapter basically to parallel Columbus's expeditions with some later explorers like Cortez in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru and South America, and of course the English settlements which came into Virginia and the New England, forming the colonies. You know, they really use the same strategies and techniques that they noted that in some of the English journals, he noted that they found that the tribesmen really wouldn't be assimilated. They had no, it was totally a foreign concept. They had no idea of what private property was or the legal system that was brought in. So they couldn't be assimilated into the culture, and of course they railed against being enslaved, so they were just killed and driven off their lands. They noted in that they what today would be called terrorism. They basically used the term massacre, where they would go in under false pretenses for treaties or negotiations, and once they were in there, they would just burn all the crops and burn out the entire villages, targeting particularly women and children, basically to shock the tribes and instill fear, and that those few that were left at the end of the day or the end of the event would basically run. And they found that this method was, you know, more efficient, and there would be less casualties for the good guys when they used that method. And of course, this escalates, because once things like that happen, then you find that there's retaliation from the tribes, and then of course there's retaliation for the retaliation, and it just escalates and becomes more and more bloody. So it goes way beyond, and this is Zinn's next point, of some of the omission of and kind of the prettying up of the stories of these settlers as they came in from Columbus right on through the colonies. You know, that from elementary school on up even through high school, and even mostly at university level, you sort of just get a whitewashed version of what happened. And he does quote another book written by Samuel Eliot Morison called Christopher Columbus Mariner. Morison, he notes, is a well-respected Columbus scholar, and he said in Morison's book he actually does touch on he mentions the atrocities, and he actually uses the word genocide in reference to Columbus, which is about as strong of a word as could be used to describe this type of attack on a culture or a race. But he notes that, you know, Morison later kind of glosses over it by heaping it all together, saying that that the dark side of Columbus, which led to some of these tragedies, also is what made him great. That it was a result of his indomitable will, his faith in God, and his relentless pursuit of his mission and objectives, which really, I think, is a tragic spin on the facts of whether you call it genocide or whatever word you choose to use. There's any type of mass killing like that, I personally don't think can be prettied up in that way, at least not honestly. Beyond the omission in the education system, he goes on to talk about. He spends a bit of time in the chapter talking about his own perspective in writing not just this chapter but the entire book. He feels that the reader should know where he's coming from, and essentially, these are my words, but he basically is using the perspective of people who came up on the short end of the stick of history, both directly and indirectly. Obviously, in this first chapter, when he talks about the indigenous tribal people, they were directly impacted. But when I say indirectly, I also I mean like the peasant class and the working class, which he says he'll talk about in later chapters, that basically, are on the winning team, so to speak, in terms of, they're Europeans and they're Americans, or, whatever side comes out the victor in any particular battle or epoch of history, but that really the majority of the common people have little to be gained, at least directly, from these revolutions, and that they really have nothing to do with them, and in some cases are against them, or at least against the methods used, but they're left holding the bag. So it is interesting the way he talks about that. The other thing in terms of some of the things that were omitted is he talks about how the lands were by and large fully populated. Yet more or less we're led to believe that they were sparsely populated, if not vacant in some places, and that this natural progression of the expansionist settlements really was sort of just a natural thing that happened, and it was destiny or divine right, to the lands, and that more or less the people were just moved out of the way with what would be termed as skirmishes, on the borders and things like that, which sort of puts a nice little bow on, and makes it sound like it wasn't quite as atrocious as these attacks really were. So that's basically his chapter. Some of my own commentaries. One of the reasons I chose this book, just to put that out there, was for this perspective, because I think just the fact of what I mentioned there at the end, where he talks about where there's a lot of people who were more or less dissenters, really are unaccounted for because they're in the working class or the peasantry class, and I think a lot of us, myself included, fail to have that perspective even in our own lives today. We give our support and personal power to a political party or an advocacy group, or any movement, even all the way down to a sports team. But really, you aren't involved in that. You sort of cheer for them and identify with them, or I do. But you'd be remiss to think that you actually are gaining anything tangible from the activities of these groups. But yet, they require all of our support in order to even exist. And this whole thing is more or less a system. And with this system, they bring in the money system, which comes with legalism, the political correctness a lot of we see today, and the slogans are a big one. Even back then, the slogans, one of the things Zinn talks about is during some of the land disputes between the Europeans and the indigenous people, they used the word natural right versus civil right, and they said that even though the indigenous people were there, giving them a natural right to the land, they had not subdued the land, was the term they used. And since they hadn't subdued the land, they didn't have a civil right to it, which meant they didn't have any legal standing in a court, which of course is a sham from the beginning, because all the court system was manned by Europeans. So it's bogus right from Jump Street. And they use other terms like inferior societies or arrested development, where in terms of Western civilization and progress and the advancement of civilization and enlightenment and terms like that, it's all spin on common themes, and that's another point Zinn argues in the chapter. If there's really such a thing as the United States or any nation and a national interest, which is, to say that there really isn't a consensus by all people. And his quote is that the memory of the state is not our own, meaning history is not the people's. So he says the memory of the state is not our own. Nations are not communities and never have been, which is sort of the point, that the dissenters and dissenting opinions are more or less forgotten in the annals of history, and as the agenda marches ahead towards this never-ending progress. And the problem with the term progress and civilization and these different things is they're undefined, and that lack of definition really serves as a point of study.